My sister walked into the rehearsal dinner holding my fiancé's hand and wearing my 5-carat diamond ring, while her belly showed everyone she was already carrying his child, and I was still sitting at the head of the table wondering why the man I was supposed to marry had not shown up, and why my sister's phone had been off for hours, and it felt like something slow and cold was sliding into my chest with every second that passed, because I knew something was wrong, but I could not name it until that moment when they arrived together, and the entire restaurant froze, and it was like I had been pulled into the kind of nightmare you cannot wake up from, because everything around me still looked so elegant, so expensive, so perfect on the surface, while everything underneath was breaking into pieces, and it had started before they even walked in, before I saw the ring, or the baby bump, or the look in her eyes, because I had felt it coming for years, and still I had tried to ignore it, and tonight was supposed to be my moment, the night before the wedding, the celebration of a love. I thought I had earned the reward for a life I had built through relentless effort and sacrifice, and even though I had organized million-dollar events and managed chaos for some of the most powerful corporations in the country, I could not seem to keep my own wedding on track, and I had been staring at the empty seat next to me for over an hour at the Ember, the most exclusive restaurant in Atlanta, where the chandeliers looked like melting crystal and every glass caught the light like it had been waiting to judge me. And my family was already sitting there around the long table, whispering things they thought I could not hear, while avoiding my eyes, and my father Leroy just kept stirring his iced tea, as if the answer were somewhere in the glass, and my mother Diane was watching me like she always did, with that tight smile that meant she was about to say something cruel dressed up as concern. And when she finally leaned in with her voice loud enough for the whole table to hear, and said, "Well, Dimmitra, it looks like your man is having second thoughts. I can't say I blame him." The air seemed to stop moving, and I told her, "Not now, Mom, please, not now." But she ignored me the way she always had, and laughed a short dry laugh, and said maybe he finally realized what he was getting into, and then she turned my Aunt Simone and said, "I told her years ago you can't build a marriage when you're too busy building an empire," and everyone around the table nodded like that made sense, and I sat there still wearing the silk dress I had picked out weeks ago, now feeling like it was strangling me, and all I wanted was for the doors to open and for Marcus to walk in and explain it all away, but instead she kept talking about how men like Marcus need attention. They need a woman who makes a home, not one who manages budgets and wears heels to boardrooms, and how Bri, my younger sister, understands that, because Bri knows that men want softness and sweetness, not spreadsheets and stress. And as she said all this, her phone buzzed, and she checked it, probably hoping for another excuse to keep going. And I wanted to disappear, because Bri had stopped answering her phone 2 hours ago, and I had told myself she was just busy, but the pit in my stomach kept growing and growing, and I could not stop myself from whispering, "Please, Mom, just stop." But she laughed and waved me off and said, "I am only saying what everyone is thinking." Maybe Marcus realized he wants the prize, not the person who buys the prize. And then the doors opened and silence fell, because it was not just Marcus who walked in, it was Marcus and Bri together holding hands, and that silence was like a slap to the face, because no one said anything, but their expressions said everything, and my mother stopped mid-sentence, and every single pair of eyes turned toward them, and even though I had already been humiliated more times than I could count by these people, something about this moment cut deeper than anything before, because it felt like a performance, a show that everyone had rehearsed except me, and I was the only one who had not seen the script. And they stood there like the stars of a romantic movie, while I sat there like an extra in my own life, and my body would not move, and my mouth would not speak, and Bri was glowing in a white silk dress that wrapped around her body and showed off a stomach that was unmistakably pregnant, and not just by a few weeks, but by several months, and she looked directly at me and smiled, and I felt my soul begin to shrink in my chest, and then I looked down and saw her hand, the one Marcus was holding, and I saw my ring, the one he had given me on the Jackson Street bridge, the 5-carat diamond passed down from his grandmother, the ring he said he had saved for the only woman he ever wanted to spend his life with, and now it was on her hand, not mine. And I think time stopped for a moment, because everything blurred and I could not hear anything except the blood rushing in my ears, and Marcus still had not looked at me not even once, and he stood there rubbing slow circles on her hand like he had done to mine during quiet evenings on the couch, and it felt like I had left my own body, like I was watching all of this happen to someone else. And then he cleared his throat and tried to speak, but the words got caught in his throat, and when he finally said thank you all for coming, his voice cracked, and it sounded like someone else talking, and he said, I know this was supposed to be a wedding rehearsal, but there's been a change of plans, and he pulled Bri closer, and she leaned into him like she had won something, and then he said we actually got married this morning, and the room fell even quieter, and I could not even process the words because it felt like a joke, a bad joke, but no one was laughing, and then Bri placed her free hand over her belly and looked straight at me, and said we are thrilled announced we are expecting a baby boy, and I heard the word boy echo through my head again and again, because we had cried over every failed fertility treatment and every test that came back empty, and now here she was carrying the child I could never give him, and before I knew what was happening my hand tightened around the crystal glass, and it shattered, and water and ice spilled across the tablecloth, and blood started dripping from my hand. But no one looked and no one cared because my mother was already standing and running to Bri, screaming with joy, hugging her, and saying she was so proud, and turning to Marcus and calling him the right choice, and saying finally we would have a grandson. And then the rest of the family stood and clapped and congratulated them, and surrounded them and left me bleeding at the table alone and invisible. And I stood up and said the house, the one we were closing on tomorrow, the one I paid $50,000 for, and Marcus looked at me with eyes like stone, and said actually Bri and I will be finalizing the closing tomorrow, it's a family home now, and then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a $100 bill and tossed it on table and said that should cover your drink, and I did not scream and I did not cry, I just turned and walked out, and the cold air hit my face and the valet called after me, but I could not hear him, and when I reached my car I collapsed into the seat and saw my reflection in the glass, a woman I barely recognized, and then my phone buzzed and I hoped it was him, but it was my mother, and her message said you embarrassed us all, why can't you just be happy for your sister? And it was my fault again, like it always was, and then my phone buzzed again, and it was a picture from Bri, a selfie of her, and Marcus in a hotel room, smiling with the ring on her finger, and her message said thanks for handing him over. And that was the moment something inside me broke, not in weakness, but in focus, and everything started to change. I did not know where I was driving, only that I could not stay at that restaurant, surrounded by the sound of their laughter echoing in my head, while the image of Bri's swollen stomach and my 5-carat ring on her finger burned itself into my memory, so I just kept going past the traffic lights, past the shopping centers, into streets where the city lights blurred into a mess of colors, as my eyes refused to cry, and my throat refused to scream, and my hands gripped the steering wheel so hard that the leather started to creak, and I kept asking myself, what did I miss, when did it start, and how could I have handed everything to her without realizing it, because that was the worst part. The way she said thanks for handing him over like this. Betrayal was something I allowed. And I remembered the night Marcus proposed 6 months ago, how he had taken me to the Jackson Street Bridge and said that ring had belonged to his grandmother and I was the only woman worthy of it. And I remembered how my mother had smirked like she was already doubting it, and how Bri had said I was lucky because men like Marcus did not usually go for women like me. And even then I had ignored it, even when she said it, while staring at the ring on my finger like it belonged to her and not to me. And now it did, because the world I built had collapsed in a single night, and I had nothing left except a car seat stained with blood from a cut I did not feel, and a phone screen with messages I would never forget, and I had given my heart, my time, my future, and $50,000 into a house Marcus and I were supposed to close on tomorrow, and now he and Bri were calling it theirs, and my mother had the nerve to tell me I was selfish for not celebrating their announcement, like I was supposed to clap for my own funeral. And then I remembered my grandmother, my only real family, the only person who ever looked at me with pride and said she was proud of the woman I became, and it was at her funeral 2 years ago when I last saw a glimpse of what love felt like, because after the fake tears and performance of grief from my Mother and sister, my grandmother's sister, my great-aunt, pulled me into a back room and sat me down and said, "Listen to me, girl, your grandmother left you something. She left you $50,000 in a trust, and no one else knows about it, not your mother, not Bry, not a soul, and she told me to use it for something real, something that would give me safety, and to never tell my mother, because she only understands money when it benefits her, and I had kept that promise. I used that inheritance as the down payment for the house Marcus and I picked out together, the house I had already emotionally moved into, and now they were moving into it like it belonged to them. And the betrayal was not just romantic, it was theft, it was a robbery of the only legacy I had from the only woman who truly loved me. And in that moment something cold and focused entered my mind, and the tears stopped, and I picked up my phone and found the one number that mattered, the one person. My grandmother trusted the one person I could trust, and I called my Aunt Imani. And when she answered on the second ring, her voice was calm, sharp like glass, cutting through my chaos, and I broke down. I told her everything. I told her they were married. I told her Bry was pregnant. I told her they were taking the house. I told her he gave her the ring, and how my mother was smiling and celebrating it, and how they acted like I was the problem, and she did not interrupt me, not once. She listened, and then when I finally stopped, she said, "Breathe," and I did, and she asked one question: "Did you do what I told you to do when Marcus said he wanted to buy the house through an LLC? Did you follow my instructions?" And I nodded, even though she could not see me. I said yes, I filed the LLC under my name. I was the organizer. I used the money from the trust. I made him sign the operating agreement you gave me, the one hidden in the loan documents. And no, he did not read it. He just signed where I told him. And then she was silent for a moment, and she laughed a cold, beautiful, terrifying sound, and she said, "Good, then they did not steal anything. They walked into the trap we laid." And I sat there frozen as her voice became steady and sharp, and she reminded me of the meeting we had in her office 2 months ago, when I had gone to her with doubts, and Marcus had said buying the house through an LLC would save on taxes, and I thought he was being smart, but she said, "No, this man does not want a shared future, he wants control, and we are going to use that against him." And she explained how in Georgia the person who files the articles of organization controls the rules, and that person was me, and she told me to insert an operating agreement that made me the sole managing member with all decision power, and Marcus was just a capital member, meaning he put in money but had no voice, no vote, no authority. And I remembered how he never even looked at the documents, how he took a phone call and signed page after page without reading a single line, because he thought I was too simple to understand business, too naive to outsmart him. And she told me then that this would happen, that he would underestimate me. And now she said, let him pay for the house, let him wire $750,000 tomorrow, thinking it is his, and then we will show him the truth. And I asked her what should I do, and she said, go home, rest, wake up early, get your hair done, put on your strongest outfit, and meet me at the closing, and say nothing. And I did exactly that. I went home and sat in the silence of the apartment. Marcus and I once shared, with his shoes still by the door and his mug still in the sink, and I opened my laptop just to distract myself, but there was an email from his lawyer titled Property Closing, and my heart stopped, and I opened it and read every word, and it said the $50,000 deposit I paid would be considered a gift to Marcus and Bry in celebration of their union, and that any attempt to recover it would result in legal action. And I nearly dropped the laptop, because they had already made their move. They were already trying to erase me from my own investment. And I called my aunt again, and she said, of course they are. They think you are weak, let them think it. And I asked her again, what do I do? And she repeated herself, tomorrow 10 o'clock. You will be there looking like you belong in that building, looking like the owner you are, and they will walk in expecting to win, and that will be the downfall. And then she said one more thing. She said, Dimmitra, they are going to destroy themselves, and all you have to do is sit still and let it happen. And that night I could not sleep, but I did not cry, I did not scream. I planned, I prepared, I put my power suit on a hanger, I booked the salon appointment, I made sure everything was ready, and when the morning came I walked into that closing office with my head held high. And when I stepped off the elevator, they were already there. Marcus in his brand new Tom Ford suit, Bry practically glowing in a maternity dress, my mother and father standing behind them like proud parents, and when they saw me already seated beside my aunt, their laughter died in their throats, and they tried to play it off. Bry came over smiling fake and sharp, and said, "Oh, how brave of you to show up," and my mother said, now, let her say good bye to the house, and I did not say a word, I just stared at them, and my silence did more damage than any words ever could, and then the closing attorney came out, and Marcus puffed up again, asking if we could get started quickly, because they had a furniture appointment, and we were ushered into the conference room, and the lawyer handed Marcus the first set of documents, and he did not read them, he just signed, and then he signed the loan documents, and said the bank was ready to wire the $750,000, and when the wire was confirmed, he smiled like a king, and Bry clapped her hands and leaned on his shoulder, and my mother said this is what real success looks like, and then the lawyer handed him the keys and said congratulations, and they erupted with joy, and my father clapped him on the back, and Bry kissed him, and they laughed like they had conquered the world, and then my aunt and I stood up and walked out without a word, because the real show was just beginning. The car ride to the house was filled with celebration and laughter like it was a parade for royalty, with Marcus at the wheel of his new black Escalade, the same one he had charged to our joint credit card just last week, and called a wedding gift to himself, while Bry sat in the passenger seat, glowing in her yellow maternity dress, her hand on her belly, and the other holding tightly onto Marcus, as she talked loudly on speaker phone about how big the house was, and how amazing the housewarming party would be, and my parents, Diane and Leroy, sat in the back smiling like they had finally been invited into the life they always thought they deserved, the rich life, the shiny life, the life with a white son-in-law who wore $1,000 suits and called their daughter baby, and they drove through the upscale streets of Maple Drive like they owned the whole neighborhood, nodding at the well-trimmed lawns and polished mailboxes like they belonged. And when the Escalade pulled into the circular driveway of the house I had picked out, the house I had dreamed of for months, Bry was the first to jump out and gasp and say, "Oh my God, it is perfect, Marcus, it is just perfect," and she ran up the stone steps, her heels clicking against the stone as she looked back at him, and blew a kiss, and called it their new life and their new beginning. And then she turned to the front door, the big oak one with the iron handle, and started digging in her purse for the keys the lawyer had handed them at the closing, and she pulled out the set like she had just won the lottery, and with a bright smile she pushed the key into the lock and twisted, but nothing happened. The smile fell just slightly, and she tried again, pushing harder, and still the key would not turn, and she looked back and said, "I think the lock is broken," and Marcus sighed and said, "You are not doing it right, let me handle it." And he walked up with the confidence of a man who believed everything in the world was under his control, and he took the keys from her and tried to open the door, and then frowned when the key still did not work, and muttered what the hell before pushing harder and jiggling the lock like he was offended by the resistance. And then he stopped and stared at the deadbolt because it looked different, newer, stronger, and then he pulled out his phone and said, "This is ridiculous, I am calling the lawyer. Henderson gave us the wrong keys," and just as he tapped the screen, the door opened from the inside, and there stood my Aunt Imani, dressed in a flawless gray suit, holding a thick leather folder, her arms crossed and her expression calm, and she looked at them like they were delivermen who had arrived too early. She said, "Good afternoon, may I help you?" And Marcus blinked and said, "Imani, what are you doing here? How did you get in?" And she said, "I used my key," and Bry stepped forward, her face twisted into disbelief, and said, "What are you doing here? This is our house, get out." And my aunt tilted her head and said, "Your house? That is interesting, because according to the documents I have, that is not quite accurate." And Marcus said, "This is not a game. We closed on this property less than 30 minutes ago, and this is my house, and I am asking you to leave before I call the police." And my aunt opened her folder and tapped a page and said, "Are you referring to the property located at 123 Maple Drive, purchased by Maple Drive Holdings, LC?" And Marcus snapped, "Yes, you know exactly what I am talking about." And my aunt said, "Then I am afraid you are the one who needs to leave, because according to the operating agreement of that LLC, which you signed, the sole managing member with 100% of voting power is my client, Miss Dimmitra Williams, and that means she owns the house." And Bry shouted, "What? That is a lie." And my aunt calmly held up the signed document and said, "It is all right here. You did not read it, and Marcus stared at the paper like it was written in another language, and then a car pulled up behind the Escalade, and I stepped out wearing my navy blue suit, and walked up the path without saying a word, and Marcus looked at me like he had seen a ghost, and shook his head saying no over again like he could rewind time and fix it, but the truth had already wrapped around him, and when he finally yelled, "I just wired $750,000 for this house, I paid for it," and my aunt said yes, and on behalf of my client, thank you for paying off her mortgage, and we are very grateful, and he looked like he was about to vomit, and Bry began crying again, screaming that the $50,000 was their money, and this was a joint venture, and my aunt laughed and said no, that money came from a private trust left to Miss Williams by her grandmother, and you signed addendum that clearly stated it was her sole investment in exchange for full control, and that means you now own nothing, you have zero equity, zero authority. And you are not and never will be an owner of this house. And Marcus's face went from pale to red in seconds, and Bry's mouth hung open like she could not breathe, and she whispered no, and then shouted no again before running to the door and pounding on it, and crying, "It is my house, he promised me," and then her knees gave out, and she collapsed on the steps sobbing and screaming like a child denied candy, and saying, "I hate you both, I hate you." And my mother finally snapped and ran over, not to help Bry but to scream at me, and she pointed a finger at my chest and shouted, "You did this, you twisted selfish girl. How could you do this to your own sister?" And I did not move, I just looked at her and said, "You made your choice last night at the restaurant, you hugged her, while I bled you clapped for them, while I shattered, and now you can live with it, because this is my house and you are trespassing. And I suggest you leave," and Marcus was shaking now, his hand pointing at my aunt, and shouting, "You will regret this, I will sue you, I will take your license," and my aunt calmly adjusted her sleeve, and said, "I would love to see your lawyer explain how you tried to steal $50,000 from your ex-fiancé using forged legal claims," and Marcus was sputtering when the rumble of a diesel engine cut through the air, and a massive yellow tow truck pulled into the driveway, and the man in overalls stepped out and walked past all of us, and said, "I am here for the King vehicle repossession order," and Marcus screamed that it was a mistake, that he had just bought that car last week, and the man shrugged and said, "Not my problem, talk to the bank. I am just here to take it," and then my aunt said, "Oh, I must have forgotten to mention the credit card," and Marcus turned around and said, "What credit card?" and I said, "The joint one you used for the Escalade, and I called the bank this morning and told them my co-signer had committed fraud and was trying to liquidate our assets, and they froze it, and now your payment bounced, and the dealership wants their car back," and the driver was already hooking chains around the wheels, and the Escalade lifted off the ground, groaning and swaying, and Bry screamed again, and Diane covered her mouth, and Marcus lunged toward the truck, but the driver said, "You touch me, I call the cops," and got into the cab, and pulled away with their brand new life dangling behind him, and Marcus turned red with fury, his eyes burning with hate, and he lunged not at me, but at my aunt, his hands raised and shaking, and he screamed, "You conniving old witch," and she did not flinch. She just said, "Touch me and I will press charges," and the video of a white man attacking a black senior citizen in front of witnesses will not help your case, and Marcus froze, realizing he was out of moves, and then I stepped forward and said, "Actually, Marcus, she is not the one you should worry about," and he turned to me and said, "I will ruin you, I will destroy you," and I said, "Too late, I already sent your company's ethics board every document, the photos, the bank statements, the emails, and even the one where you convinced my mother to move her entire retirement into your failing private equity fund, and I told them it looked like elder financial abuse and fraud, and they were very interested, and Marcus looked like his world had ended, and Bry tried to pull him back, saying, "We can fix this," and he turned on her and shouted, "You told me she was stupid. You said she could not spell LLC, and now look at us," and my mother tried to stop him, and he yelled at her too, and then he turned back to Bry and screamed, "This is your fault, you trapped me with that thing," and then shoved her hard, and she stumbled and fell on the grass, her breath knocked out of her. And the street was silent until my father Leroy finally moved and roared, "Get away from her," and punched Marcus in the face, knocking him to the driveway, and blood started pouring from Marcus's mouth, and my mother screamed, and then sirens came, and the police arrived, and neighbors stepped out with Their phones and Marcus got handcuffed and Bry cried, and Diane begged and Leroy said nothing, except finally, and the truth of who they really were was now visible to everyone. The chaos unfolding on the perfect green lawn of 123 Maple Drive did not just belong to me anymore, it belonged to everyone watching, and when the first police cruiser turned onto the street, its lights flashing in blue and red reflections across the expensive cars and manicured hedges, the whole neighborhood seemed to pause and breathe in the drama like it was theater, and a second cruiser followed immediately behind, and by now all the neighbors had stepped out onto their porches, onto their driveways, phones raised recording every second, and I stood there on my own front steps in a tailored navy suit, still holding the leather folder my aunt had given me while my mother paced near the edge of the lawn in hysterics. My sister Bry was still collapsed on the grass, holding her belly, her face red from crying, and Marcus sat on the curb wiping blood from his lip, muttering to himself, like he could talk his way out of the mess, and my father Leroy stood quietly, but the rage in his eyes was still fresh like the punch he had just thrown, had barely scratched the surface of what he wanted to release, and when the two officers got out of the cruiser, they looked around quickly, one of them speaking into a radio while the taller one walked forward and said, "All right, what is going on here? We got a report about a physical assault and possible trespassing," and before anyone else could answer, Marcus jumped to his feet and pointed at my father, shouting, "That man just punched me, I want him arrested," and Diane rushed forward, her hands fluttering, and her voice high, saying, "No, no, officer. It was all just a misunderstanding, just a family matter, no need to escalate this, please." And the second officer held up a hand and told my father, "Sir, I need you to take a step back, please, stay calm." That was when Marcus pointed toward me and said, "And them too, they are the real problem, they broke in. They changed the locks, they are refusing to leave. This is my house, I bought it, and I demand they be removed." And he said it like he believed it still believed, that all his lies and confidence could erase the truth. But the officers turned to me, and I stepped forward without hesitation, folder in hand, my voice steady, and I said, "Officers, here are the ownership documents for this property. It is legally owned by Maple Drive Holdings LLC, and here is the signed operating agreement stating that I, Dimmitra Williams, am the sole managing member and have 100% authority over the property." And the taller officer took the folder, flipping through the pages quickly, and when he looked back up, there was less confusion in his face because it was all there in writing. And I said, "They have been asked to leave multiple times and are trespassing," and more than that, I added calmly, "The man you are speaking to physically assaulted the woman on the lawn who is 5 months pregnant. She is my sister." And that was the moment the energy shifted completely, because now it was not just a family feud or a property dispute, it was a criminal matter, and the officer's expression hardened, and he turned to Marcus and said, "Sir, turn around and place your hands behind your back." And Marcus shouted, "What, are you serious? This is insane, she is lying." And the officer said, "You are being arrested. Assault, now comply." And the handcuffs clicked loud and final as they locked around his wrists, and that sound rang through the neighborhood louder than any scream, louder than any engine, louder than any slap. It was the sound of the mask finally breaking, and as Marcus was pulled toward the cruiser, his expensive suit rumpled and stained, and his hands cuffed behind him, the neighbors watched silent and fascinated, their phones recording the fall of the man they had probably been introduced to as the perfect fiancé, the golden son-in-law, the one who came from old money and worked in high finance, always smiled just a little too wide. And the police placed him in the back seat of the cruiser and slammed the door, and Bry let out a fresh sob and Diane screamed, and I just stood there still silent until Marcus looked at me through the car window, and his face twisted into something venomous, and he said, "You will regret this, you will regret this, Dimmitra." And I looked him right in the eye and said, "Regret, Marcus, is like trust, you have to earn it. It is not something I just hand out." And then the door closed and the car began to pull away, and that was when Bry finally stood, her face blotchy, tear-stained, her hands clenched into fists, and she screamed, "You did this, you ruined everything, you took him from me, and I will never forgive you." And she tried to lunge toward me, but my father caught her by the arm, holding her back, and I did not move, I did not flinch, I just stared at her and said, Forgiveness, Bry, like this house, is something you do not get to have, and her scream cracked and twisted in the air, and she dropped to her knees on the steps again as the police drove away with Marcus, and the quiet returned, but the damage was permanent, and by that evening the videos had made their way online, and what the neighborhood was calling the Maple Drive meltdown was trending locally, with clips showing Marcus in cuffs, Bry screaming, Diane crying, and me standing perfectly still on my porch, and inside my house my aunt and I sat together in the empty living room drinking tea while news alerts started hitting our phones, and my aunt scrolled through her feed with a quiet, satisfied expression and said they are calling it the Maple Drive meltdown, and it looks like your mother's reputation is officially in ruins. And I looked at the screen and saw comments piling in calling out Marcus for assault, for fraud, for being a con artist, and others questioning who Bry was and how anyone could betray their sister so publicly. And I saw photos of me standing on the porch circulating with captions like she planned it all, and that was not wrong, I did plan it, but not for revenge, for justice. And then just before 6 o'clock my aunt pointed to the television and said, you are going to want to see this, and she turned it on to Channel 2, where the anchor said a dramatic scene unfolded today in one of Atlanta's wealthiest neighborhoods, and they showed the video of Marcus being cuffed, then Bry screaming, then Diane wailing, and then a new clip appeared from the courthouse steps, my aunt standing in front of microphones, looking flawless and powerful. And she said this is not just a family dispute, it is a case of financial manipulation, emotional betrayal, and illegal activity. And when the reporter asked if I was a victim, she said my client Miss Williams was betrayed by her fiancé and her sister, who attempted to defraud her and take her home and inheritance, but Miss Williams protected her assets and stood firm. And then the news anchor returned and said Marcus King has been suspended from his firm pending investigation into allegations of misconduct and fraud. And I sat back against the couch letting that wash over me, because I knew it was just the beginning. And my aunt smiled again and said, you took back more than your house, you took back your story. And she was right, the story was no longer what they tried to make it. I was no longer the victim crying into her dress at a restaurant table. I was the woman who outsmarted a predator, who used the law and truth as weapons, and took back what was mine and the world had watched. And by the next morning the story had gone from local gossip to viral scandal. The headlines would not stop coming, and for the next 2 days my phone stayed hot in my hands as the story spiraled far beyond what any of us imagined, and news stations from other states picked up the clips and talk shows started weighing in, and hashtags trended across social media, and strangers flooded my inbox with messages of support, disbelief, questions, and some cruel assumptions. But I ignored the noise and focused only on the facts, because I had come too far to let anything shake me now. And my aunt was already working behind the scenes, contacting Marcus's firm, delivering evidence, the ethics committee showing transactions and property records that clearly proved he had used our engagement as a cover to siphon funds and gain access to assets that were never his, and her law firm knew exactly how to handle men like him, because they had torn apart bigger frauds before. And on third day after Marcus's arrest, Bry showed up again, and this time she came alone, without Diane, without the sobbing or the theatrics, just herself, standing at the edge of the driveway, holding her stomach like a shield. And I stepped outside, not to argue, but because I wanted to look her in the eye and see what kind of sister could still face me after all of this. And Bry's voice was quiet, but not soft, and she said, I do not want anything from you, I just want to talk. And I said, you do not get to talk to me like we are equals, Bry. You burned that bridge. And she nodded once and said, I know. And she looked thinner, more worn down, and I realized that maybe this had taken more out of her than I thought, or maybe she was just trying to play a new angle. And she said, I did love him, you know. I loved him before you ever met him. And I laughed bitterly and said, and he still chose me first. And she flinched at that and said, but he stayed with me, and I got pregnant with his child, and I deserve something. And I said, what you deserve is a long look in the mirror. And then I asked her, do you really believe that loving him excuses everything you did to me? And she did not answer, not with words. And the silence was enough, because it told me she was not sorry, not truly, and maybe she never would be. And that was when she said, I lost everything because of you. And I said, no, you lost everything because you gambled with someone else's life. and the bet failed and I walked back inside without another word. And later that same evening, Diane called me for the first time in over a week, and her voice was quiet but not cold, and she said, "I just want to talk," and I said, "I do not owe you anything," and she said, "Please," and there was something about the way she said it that made me pause, and she came over an hour later alone, and sat in the same living room where she used to sip tea and criticize my choices, and she said, "I am sorry," and I said, "For what? Be specific," and she looked me in the eye and said, "I am sorry for choosing appearances over honesty, for pushing Marcus on you because of how he looked on paper, for letting Bry twist the truth because it was easier than facing it, and I am sorry for not protecting you when you needed me most." And it was the first time she had ever said anything close to real accountability, and I could see that even she knew this scandal had cracked her armor, and she said, "I built my life around reputation, but now that is gone and all I see is how wrong I was," and I said, "And what about Bry?" And she said, "Bry is broken and lost," and I enabled her, "and now I do not know how to fix it," and I said, "Maybe it is not your job to fix her, and maybe it never was," and Diane nodded like she had already thought the same thing, and I asked her why now, why this apology, and she said, "Because I saw what you did, how you handled everything, how you stood tall when we all tried to tear you down, and I realized you are the only one in this family who ever truly stood for something," and that hit me like a weight, and I did not know if I was ready to forgive her, but I also knew that I was not holding on to anger the way I used to. And a few days later, I received a certified letter from Marcus's attorney requesting a settlement discussion, and my aunt laughed so hard she nearly cried, and said he is trying to negotiate his way out of a hole he dug himself into, and she prepared a full response with all the legal documents with a counter-offer that required him to relinquish any claim to the property, any claim to shared investments, and to publicly issue a statement admitting to misconduct and fraud, and we knew he would never do it, but we also knew he had no cards left to play, and the firm had already begun proceedings to cut him loose. His reputation in finance was over, and the whispers about other shady deals were beginning to pile up, and Bry meanwhile tried to salvage what little pride she had left, but most of the family refused to speak to her, not out of loyalty to me, but because they did not want their names associated with the scandal, and Diane kept her distance from both of us, quietly retreating from society events and deleting her social media, and I started to breathe again for the first time in months, and I spent my mornings walking through the neighborhood with my head high, no longer hiding behind headphones or sunglasses, and people waved and smiled, and a few even came up to me and said, "We are proud of you," or "You handled that better than anyone could have," and those words carried weight because they came without agenda, and I started redesigning the house, removing every trace of Marcus's taste and choices, replacing the furniture with pieces I chose myself, repainting the walls, rehanging art that actually meant something to me, and one day I found the old wedding binder tucked in the back of a closet, and I sat on the floor and opened it slowly, page by page, remembering how excited I used to be about that day, and I let myself feel the grief not for him, but for the version of myself that believed everything would be perfect, and I cried. And then I stood up and threw the entire binder into the trash, because I was done letting ghosts live in my house, and weeks passed, and then months, and I kept building a new version of myself, one rooted in reality, not fantasy, and people began asking if I would ever date again, if I was ready for someone new, and I said maybe one day, but not yet, because I had no interest in filling the silence with just anyone, and I had learned the hard way that love without truth is just a performance, and I wanted the real thing, not the illusion. And one afternoon in late spring, I hosted a small dinner at the house for close friends, just laughter, music, and good food, and my aunt raised a glass and said to the woman who took back her story, and we all toasted, and I realized that maybe this was the life I was always supposed to have, not the fairy tale, not the big wedding, not the perfect photos, but this, the truth, the strength, the peace. And that night I stood on the balcony looking out at the city lights, and I felt free, not because they were gone, but because they no longer had any power over me. The weeks melted into summer, and though the world had gone quiet around me, the fallout of everything that happened still lingered like a shadow just beyond the edge of every peaceful moment. And while I tried to rebuild, there were reminders I could not entirely shake, like the way Bry's face would still show up on gossip blogs, or the occasional photo from someone who spotted her at a prenatal appointment looking tired and withdrawn, and part of me wanted to ignore it all, but another part of me could not help wondering how she would live with the choices she made. And sometimes at night, when I would sit on my porch watching the lights flicker across the city, I would think about how different things could have been if she had just told the truth from the beginning, if Marcus had just walked away instead of playing us both like pieces on a board. And then I would push the thoughts aside because they were no longer mine to carry, and one evening, while sorting through old storage boxes in my attic, I stumbled across a letter dated from 2008, written in Bry's handwriting, addressed to Marcus, and it was unopened, folded carefully, and wedged between the pages of an old book I used to keep by my bedside, and my hands trembled as I peeled it open, and read the words that spilled out across the page, not with affection but desperation and fear. And she had written about feeling like she was always behind, like I had everything handed to me, while she had to fight for crumbs. She said, I never wanted to hurt her, but I do not know who I am if I am not better than her in something, anything. And I felt a cold stab of clarity, because in that letter I saw the seed of everything she had done, not born of love, but of envy and pain. And I sat there with the letter in my lap, and the weight of years pressing on my chest, and I realized that while I could not forgive her, I could understand her, even if only a little. And I did not tell anyone about the letter, not even my aunt, because it was not ammunition. It was simply proof of something I had always suspected. And the next day I burned it in the fireplace without ceremony, watching the paper curl into ash, because I was done letting the past control my present. And a week later I received an invitation to a formal gala, one I had been blacklisted from last year, when Marcus's influence was still strong, and it was addressed me directly, with a personal note saying, we admire how you carried yourself through difficulty, and we hope to honor that. And it was a small gesture, but it felt like a door reopening, one I had not realized I still wanted to walk through. And I wore a dress that made me feel like I was not dressing for revenge or appearances, but for myself. And when I walked into that hall filled with people who once whispered behind their hands, now smiling and nodding, I felt the old version of me fade just a little more. And I spent the evening talking, laughing, even dancing with an old friend from college who told me, you have changed. And I said, I know, and I like it. And when I returned home, there was a letter on my doorstep, hand delivered from Bry, and I stood there debating whether to throw it out without reading, but something told me to open it, and inside was a single page with 5 sentences. I know I destroyed everything. I know I cannot undo it. I do not expect forgiveness. I only hope the baby does not grow up carrying my mistakes, and I will never ask anything of you again. And it was the first time her words felt stripped of performance, and though I did not cry or write back, I also did not hate her anymore, not in the way I used to, because I understood now that her choices were a reflection of her wounds, not my worth. And the following day I got a call from a nonprofit group that focused on helping women recover from financial and emotional betrayal, asking if I would be willing to speak at their conference. And I almost said no, because the idea of standing in front of strangers reliving everything was daunting, but something in me whispered, this is how you turn pain into power. And I said yes. And over the next few weeks I prepared my speech, not with bitterness, but with honesty and wit. I stood on that stage and told the truth about love, lies, betrayal, and survival. The applause that followed felt like more than noise. It felt like release. And that night I received hundreds of messages from women who said thank you for saying what we could not, thank you for surviving out loud. And I realized then that maybe this was the beginning of a new chapter, one not built around what had happened to me, but around what I would do with it. And months passed, and Bry gave birth quietly without much fanfare, and I heard through distant cousins that she named the baby Hope, and something about that name made me pause, because maybe she was trying to rewrite her own story in a way that would not repeat the past. And Diane reached out again, not with questions or requests, but with updates, small ones like I planted new flowers today, or I started painting again, and we slowly rebuilt something. Not the mother-daughter bond we once pretended to have, but something more honest, and I told her I would never forget how she failed me, but I also saw that she was trying, and sometimes effort matters more than perfection, and I continued working with the nonprofit, speaking, mentoring, even helping organize retreats, and in helping others I found pieces of myself that I did not know were missing, and I started writing again, stories, essays, eventually a book about the experience, and the first publisher who read the draft said this is not a revenge story, this is a survival anthem, and I liked that because I was not trying to get even, I was trying to get free, and one morning, while making coffee, I received an email that the book had been accepted for publication, and I stood there in my kitchen smiling alone, and I did not rush to tell anyone because some victories are best savored in silence. And later that year I hosted a celebration at my house, not for the book, not for any specific milestone, just to gather the people who stood by me through the storm. And as I looked around at their faces, I realized that life had given me something more valuable than fairy tale love. It had given me resilience, clarity, and a community that loved me without conditions, and I had become the woman I used to admire, someone who could bend without breaking, who could lose everything and still find a reason to rise, and that was worth more than any ring, any wedding, any illusion. And I remembered how I once thought my story was ruined the moment Marcus betrayed me, and how I had feared that everything I built would crumble, but now I saw that endings are just disguised beginnings, and what we survive becomes the soil from which new life grows. And when I walked into my bedroom that night and looked in the mirror, I did not see the woman who was cheated on, or humiliated, or cast aside. I saw a woman who had walked through fire and come out golden, and I whispered to my reflection, we made it. And for the first time in years I believed it. Time moved forward even when I felt stuck, and though I had found my own strength again, there were days when the weight of everything still pressed into my chest like a silent scream, and the pain did not vanish completely, but it changed shape and became something I could carry without breaking. I began to find comfort in small things like watering my plants, or baking something new, or rearranging the books on my shelf, because these tiny moments reminded me that I was still here, still standing, still breathing. And one morning I received an unexpected phone call from Marcus's mother, a woman I had not spoken to since the wedding disaster, and my instinct was to hang up, but something in her voice kept me listening. And she said, I do not want anything from you, I just need you to hear me. And she told me how broken Marcus had become, how regret was eating him alive, how he walked through his days like a ghost, refusing to acknowledge the reality he created. And she said, I am not asking you to feel sorry for him. I know you owe him nothing. I just want you to know that he finally sees the damage, and it is destroying him. And after we hung up, I sat in silence for a long time, because hearing about his suffering did not bring me joy, but it did bring a strange kind of closure, because I had spent so long wondering if he ever regretted what he did, and now I knew, and that knowledge set me free in a way I did not expect. And later that evening I went to visit my aunt, who had always been my anchor through everything, and as we sipped tea on her porch, she asked me if I ever thought about falling in love again, and I laughed, not because it was funny, but because the idea felt so distant from where I was, and I said I do not know if I believe in it anymore, and she looked at me with those wise eyes and said, love is not a fairy tale, it is a choice, and sometimes it finds you when you least expect it, and you do not have to chase it, just live your truth and let it come, if it will. And her words stayed with me for days, and then weeks, and one afternoon I was browsing in a local bookstore and bumped into someone I had not seen in years, an old friend named Elijah, who used to be in my literature class back in college, and we had always shared a quiet understanding, a sense of humor that clicked, but life had pulled us in different directions, and now here he was standing in front of me with the same kind eyes and an easy smile, and we talked for hours right there in the aisle, laughing and catching up, and he told me about his life, about the divorce he went through 2 years ago, about how he started a nonprofit teaching writing to at-risk teens, and I shared some of my own journey And we exchanged numbers without pressure, without expectations, just a simple reconnection. And over the next few weeks, we met up again and again, sometimes for coffee, sometimes for long walks through the park. And there was something so gentle about him, something safe, and I found myself smiling without realizing and looking forward to his messages, and it felt different, not like a rush of passion, but like warmth seeping into cold places. And one evening, as we sat under the stars, he reached out and held my hand and said, "I do not want to rush anything, but I feel something real here," and I nodded because I felt it too, and we took things slow, intentionally, carefully allowing trust to rebuild in its own time. And I never once compared him to Marcus, because Elijah was nothing like him, and that was the beauty of it. And he saw me not as a trophy or a prize, but as a person with layers and scars and strength. And when he told me, "I admire your courage more than anything," it felt sincere and grounding. And during this time, I continued working with the nonprofit, sharing my story, mentoring young women, helping them find their voices, and it gave me purpose beyond my own pain. And the book I had written gained traction slowly at first, but then steadily, with more people reaching out telling me that my words helped them survive their own heartbreak. And one reader wrote to me saying, "You gave me the strength to walk away from someone who made me feel small." And I cried reading that message, because I remembered how small I had once felt, and it reminded me why I kept writing, why I kept showing up. And in the middle of all this progress, I received a letter in the mail, a handwritten envelope addressed in delicate cursive, and when I opened it, I found a photograph of a baby girl no older than 6 months, with a note that simply said, "Her name is Hope, and she smiles like you," and there was no signature, but I knew it was from Bry, and I stared at that photo for a long time, the baby's eyes bright and curious, and a strange mixture of sorrow and tenderness rose in my chest, because this child had been born into a mess she did not create, and I hoped with everything in me that she would grow up loved and safe and far from the shadows of betrayal. And I placed the photo in a drawer, not out of spite, but because I was not ready to face that part of my past yet, and maybe one day I would be, but not now. And as autumn settled in, I found myself waking up feeling lighter, not always happy, but no longer haunted. And Elijah and I continued to grow closer, finding rhythm in the quiet steadiness of our bond. And he never asked about Marcus, never pressed for details unless I offered them, and I appreciated that more than I could say. And we spent a weekend in the mountains hiking and cooking and just being away from everything. And one night by the fire he looked at me and said, "I want to build something real with you when you are ready." And I took his hand and replied, "I am getting there." That was enough, and by the time winter rolled around, my book was being discussed on morning shows and podcasts, and invitations rolled in to speak at larger events. And I said yes to the ones that aligned with my heart, and no to the ones that felt like they just wanted a scandal. And I kept writing, working on my second book, this time about reclaiming identity after loss. And one morning, while sorting through old emails, I came across a draft I had written years ago, before the wedding, before everything, and it was a list of dreams and goals. And as I read through it, I realized I had accomplished many of them, just not in the way I expected, and that realization made me smile, because life had not gone according to plan, but it had still led me to something meaningful. And that night I sat on my porch, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the stars, and I whispered thank you, not to anyone in particular, just to the universe for carrying me through. And when Elijah joined me, placing a cup of tea in my hand and resting his head on my shoulder, I felt a peace I had not known in years, and I knew then that love was not always grand or dramatic. Sometimes it was quiet, steady, and earned, and I would not trade that for anything. The morning after our quiet evening under the stars, I woke up with a strange blend of peace and tension in my chest, because while everything between Elijah and I felt safe and natural, there was still a storm building quietly behind the scenes, and I had no idea it was about to erupt in a way I could never prepare for, because sometimes betrayal does not finish when you walk away from it. Sometimes it circles back just when you start breathing again. And that was what happened the moment I received a court summons in the mail, and I remember the way the envelope trembled in my hand before I even opened it, because something inside me already knew it was not just a letter. It was a declaration of war, and when I pulled out the folded pages and read the words in silence, the air left my lungs and my heart pounded with disbelief, because Bry was suing me for emotional distress, claiming that I had defamed her with the book I wrote, and that my version of the story had damaged her reputation, caused her mental health issues, and now she wanted compensation for pain I had apparently caused by telling the truth, and I sat on my living room floor for a long time holding those papers, not crying, not yelling, just frozen in disbelief that she would go to such lengths to rewrite the narrative and place herself as the victim in a story where she had torn everything apart. And when Elijah arrived later that evening, he found me still sitting there, and he took the papers from my hands, read them quietly, and then wrapped his arms around me and said, "She is trying to break you again, but we are not going to let that happen." And I believed him, because by now I had learned how to survive storms even when they came from people who once shared your blood. And the next morning I called my lawyer, a woman named Dana, who had helped me negotiate the rights for my book. And when I told her about the lawsuit, she sighed and said, "This is not uncommon. When someone cannot control the truth, they try to silence the one who tells it." And she walked me through the steps we needed to take and assured me that truth was a defense and I would not be facing this alone. And even though her words comforted me, the weight of it all settled into my body like wet cement, and I could feel the past trying to pull me back into the darkness, and I fought it with everything I had, because I had already rebuilt myself once, and I would not be shattered again. And as the court date approached, I found myself reflecting on how far I had come, and how absurd it was that the same sister who betrayed me so deeply now wanted to punish me for surviving it, and for telling my story in my own words. And during this time Elijah remained a constant source of strength, cooking dinner when I was too exhausted to move, rubbing my back when anxiety made it hard to breathe, and never once trying to fix it, just being there holding space and offering love that did not demand performance or perfection. And the night before the court appearance I could not sleep because my thoughts were spinning with every possible scenario, every way this could backfire, and I remembered the shame I once carried, the guilt, the fear, and I worried that being dragged into a courtroom would undo all the healing I had fought for. And when the morning arrived, I dressed carefully in a simple navy dress and soft heels, not for them but for myself, because I wanted to walk in with dignity and strength. And as I stood outside the courthouse with Dana by my side, Elijah gave my hand one last squeeze and whispered, "No matter what happens, you already won." And I nodded because I knew it was true, and the courtroom was small and plain and cold. And when Bry walked in holding Marcus's hand and wearing a soft pink blouse like she was auditioning for sympathy, I looked away, not because I was afraid, but because I refused to give her the satisfaction of knowing she still held space in my heart. And during the hearing, her lawyer painted a picture of a woman ruined by lies, claiming the book had destroyed her chance at employment, her social relationships, her ability to feel safe. And I listened in silence, not because I accepted any of it, but because I wanted them to finish so I could speak. And when Dana stood and presented our defense, she did not need theatrics, because she had the truth, and she laid out the timeline, the evidence, the journal entries, the text messages, the wedding photos, the cancelled venue, contracts, everything that aligned with the book's account. And then it was my turn, and I took the stand, hand steady, voice clear, and I said I did not write my story to hurt anyone, I wrote it to survive. And if telling the truth made someone uncomfortable, that is a consequence of their own actions, not mine. And I could feel the room shift as I spoke, not with anger but with certainty, because I had carried this pain in silence for too long, and now I was finally releasing it. And when I stepped down from the stand, I saw Bry's face for the first time, and there was no rage in her expression, only something that looked like shame or regret. But it did not matter anymore, because I no longer needed her to feel anything for my healing to matter. And the judge took a few days to deliberate, and during that time I tried not to dwell on the outcome, focusing instead on the life I had built, the one that could not be taken away by courtrooms or bitterness. And when the verdict arrived, it was clear and swift. The court ruled in my favor, stating that the book was a personal memoir supported by factual evidence and did not qualify as defamation, and the case was dismissed, and Bry was ordered to cover my legal costs. And when I received the news I did not cheer, I did not celebrate, I simply closed my eyes and took the deepest breath I had taken in years, because it was over not just the case, but the hold she had on me, and I realized then that closure does not come with apologies, it comes with clarity, and I had found mine, and that evening Elijah took me out to a small rooftop restaurant where we toasted with sparkling water and shared a quiet meal under the city lights, and he said, "I hope you know how proud I am of you," and I said, "I am proud of me too," and we laughed because it felt so simple and so profound at the same time. And later that night I stood on my balcony staring at the stars and whispered, "I forgive you not for you, but for me, because I cannot carry this anymore, and I deserve to be free." And for the first time I felt like I truly meant it, because forgiveness is not about excusing what was done, it is about refusing to let it control you, and I was done being controlled. And as I lay down to sleep that night, I thought about how many people stay trapped in pain because they are afraid to tell their story, and I made a promise to myself that I would keep telling mine, not just for me, but for anyone else who needed to hear that it was okay to walk away, to speak up, to choose themselves. And that was the night I reclaimed the last piece of my voice. The days after the court victory felt like quiet healing, where nothing dramatic happened, but everything still shifted. And for the first time in what felt like years, I did not wake up dreading a message or a memory. I did not spend the evenings staring at my ceiling, counting regrets. I simply breathed, moved, slept, and smiled, sometimes without even realizing it, and that in itself felt like the greatest win, because I had reached a place where peace was no longer a stranger. And one afternoon, while Elijah and I were walking through a local street market hand in hand, looking at hand-made jewelry and tasting samples of candied fruit, he turned to me with a thoughtful expression and said, "What would you think about moving?" And I laughed, thinking he meant changing apartments. But then he said, "No, I mean really moving somewhere quiet with space, trees, maybe a porch." And for a second I thought he was joking, until I saw the seriousness in his eyes, and my first instinct was hesitation, not because I did not want it, but because I was so used to fighting for the little peace I had that the idea of pursuing more felt almost selfish. But he kept going, telling me how he had been saving for years for something long-term, and how the city had started feeling too crowded, too loud, and how he wanted a place where we could build something new from the ground. And as he spoke, I felt a tug deep in my chest, because I had always imagined myself rooted in one place out of necessity. But suddenly the idea of starting again somewhere new felt like freedom, and that night we sat on the floor of his apartment with real estate listings spread out between us and mugs of tea going cold as we talked about the kind of place we wanted: a home with light that came through big windows, with a garden in back and space to work and breathe and just exist without pressure. And within a few weeks we found it, a small house on the edge of a quiet town with a cracked driveway and peeling shutters, but good bones and more silence than I had ever known. And we spent weekends driving out to paint the walls ourselves, choosing colors that made us feel calm, carrying boxes one by one until the rooms slowly became ours. And I documented every step with photos and small journal entries, not for anyone else, but for myself, to remind me that good things can grow from the ashes of destruction. And one afternoon, while unpacking a box labeled Memories, I found an old notebook, the one I used to keep tucked under my mattress during the worst days, and I flipped through the pages, reading thoughts I had forgotten, feelings I once thought would bury me, and I smiled, not because they were beautiful, but because I had made it through them. And that evening I took that notebook and buried it at the base of a new rose bush in our yard, as a private ritual, a quiet goodbye to the version of me that once thought I would never feel safe again. And life in the new house was not perfect, but it was peaceful, and that was enough. And Elijah built shelves for my books, and I planted herbs in the kitchen window, and we started baking bread on Sundays and walking in the evenings, and I could feel my body slowly letting go of its armor piece by piece, until I could fall asleep without double-checking the locks, or wake up without that tightness in my chest. And one morning, while sipping coffee in the backyard, I received a message from a woman I did not recognize, and her name did not register at first, but as I read her words I realized she had gone to college with me, someone who had followed my story and read the book And she said, I just want to thank you for having the courage to speak because I saw myself in those pages, and it made me feel less alone, and I sat with her message for a long time, staring at the words and thinking about how much fear I had carried when I first wrote that book, worried it would destroy me, and now here I was being reminded that truth has power not just for the one who speaks it, but for everyone who hears it. And in the months that followed, more messages came, sometimes just a sentence, sometimes long stories, people telling me about betrayals they survived or marriages they escaped or families they walked away from, and every time I responded not with advice, but with understanding, because sometimes all we need is to be seen and heard and not judged. And eventually Elijah and I started hosting small gatherings in our home, inviting a few neighbors and friends over for dinner and music and laughter. And one evening, as people were leaving and the last candle had been blown out, I sat on the front porch with a blanket around my shoulders and thought, this is what safety feels like. And then something unexpected happened, because life does not always follow a clean arc. Sometimes it loops back to test you, and it happened on a Wednesday morning when a letter arrived addressed to me in handwriting. I recognized immediately, and my heart stuttered because I had not heard from Bry since the court case, and now here was this envelope sitting on my kitchen counter daring me to open it, and I did slowly, carefully, and inside was a short letter with no apology, no explanation, just a sentence that said, I saw the house in the magazine. It looks like you found what you wanted. And for a second I did not know how to feel, because part of me wanted to throw it away, and the other part felt an ache like a memory of something that once mattered. And I folded the letter neatly and placed it in a drawer, not because I wanted to keep it, but because I needed a reminder that even when the past knocks, you do not have to let it in. And I told Elijah about it that evening, and he just nodded and said, she still does not get it, does she? And I smiled sadly, because no, she probably never would, and that was not my responsibility anymore. And around that time I began writing again, not about her, not about the betrayal, but about healing and growth and quiet joy. And I started sharing small pieces, online essays and reflections, and soon enough a publisher reached out asking if I had considered writing a follow-up, and I had not, but the more I thought about it, the more it felt right, and I spent the next 6 months pouring my heart into the pages, not to rehash the past, but to celebrate the future. And when the book launched, I held a small event in our backyard, fairy lights strung between trees, soft music playing, and people who had walked beside me in silence now standing beside me in celebration. And Elijah raised a toast and said, here is to the girl who turned pain into purpose. And I laughed through tears, because that was exactly what I had done. And that night, as the stars blinked above and the last guest left, I stood alone in the garden, barefoot in the grass, and whispered to myself, you did it, you made it. And I felt a sense of peace so complete it wrapped around me like a second skin. And I knew then that no matter what the future held, I would face it with open eyes and steady hands, because I had built a life worth living, and no one could take that from me again. There was something quietly triumphant about the way normal life settled into our bones, like it had always belonged there. And as months turned into a steady rhythm of simple joys and small victories, I began to notice how far I had come, not just physically in a new home or professionally with a second book, but emotionally in ways no one could measure but me. And I found myself laughing more, not the cautious kind that checks for shadows, but the full sound that rises without permission. And one evening, while Elijah was fixing a loose cabinet door and I was folding laundry, we heard a knock on the front door, and for a brief second every part of me froze, old habits resurfacing, before I forced myself to breathe and open it. And standing there was my mother, holding a small potted plant, and wearing that uncertain smile she used when she knew she had no right to ask for anything but came anyway. And my instinct was to shut the door, not out of anger, but from the deep, tired place that remembers all the years she stood silent when she should have spoken. But I stood still watching her, and she said softly, I heard about the book, and I just wanted to say you wrote it beautifully. And for a moment I could not speak, because her words carried a weight I did not know how to hold. And then she added, I know I was not the mother you needed, and I cannot change that, but I wanted you to know I am proud of you. And I felt my eyes sting, not because her presence fixed anything, but because for once She came without excuses, just truth, and that mattered more than I expected, and I nodded, not ready to let her in, but willing to meet her in the doorway, and she did not push, she just handed me the plant, and said, "This is rosemary, it is for remembrance, and I hope you will think of the good parts too." And then she left, and I stood there holding the small pot in both hands like it was something sacred, and when Elijah asked who it was I just said my mother, and he nodded and went back to fixing the cabinet because he knew better than to press, and later that night I placed the rosemary by the kitchen window where it caught the sun, and every time I watered it, I thought about the few good memories like learning to bake or how she used to braid my hair, and I let those live beside the pain without pretending one erased the other, and that became a pattern in my healing, letting things sit side by side, the light and the dark, the betrayal and the resilience, the loss and the gain, and it made me softer, not weaker. And one weekend Elijah and I decided to host a writing retreat at our home, inviting a handful of women who had reached out over the past year, and we spent 2 days sharing stories, cooking together, writing under the trees, and one woman sat beside me at dusk and said, "Do you ever miss them?" And I knew she meant my family, not just my sister or my mother, but all of it, the whole tangled web, and I thought about it for a while before answering. I missed the idea of what I thought they were not what they actually were, and she nodded slowly like she understood, because she did. And during that retreat something unexpected happened. I received a call from a former professor who had read my book and wanted to nominate it for an award, and I laughed nervously because award had never been my goal, but he insisted, and a few months later I was invited to speak at a university event, and standing on that stage in front of rows of young faces, I remembered the version of myself who once sat in those same seats, small, afraid, unsure, and I looked out at them and said, "You are allowed to walk away from anything that does not love you well," and their silence told me they understood. And after the event a girl approached me in tears, thanking me for putting into words what she had been feeling for years, and I hugged her tightly because I knew exactly what that moment meant. And back home Elijah and I celebrated quietly with takeout and a movie, and I told him sometimes I cannot believe this is my life, and he said, "That is how you know you earned it." And sometime after that I received another letter, this time from a woman claiming to be the mother of Caleb's child. She had read about everything in the news and online, and wanted to say she believed me, and that she had gone through her own nightmare with him. And reading her words, I felt a strange kind of grief for all the women hurt by the same man, who once stood beside me in a tuxedo, smiling and making promises he never meant. And I replied to her with kindness, because we were not enemies, we were survivors. And for days after that I kept thinking about how many versions of Caleb existed depending on who you asked, and it made me even more grateful for the life I had built far away from that chaos. And one chilly morning, while walking through the nearby park, I spotted a young couple arguing, and something about their body language made me pause, the way she shrunk into herself, the way his hand hovered too close, and I hesitated, unsure of whether to step in. And then I made eye contact with her, and I mouthed, "You okay?" And she looked at me for a long beat before shaking her head, and I walked over, pretending to bump into them, and said loudly, "Oh my God, I have not seen you in forever," and looped my arm through hers like we were old friends, and she went with it instantly, and we walked away together without looking back. And only when we reached the street corner did she break down, and I stood there holding her as she cried. And when she calmed, I gave her my number and told her she was not alone, and that moment reminded me that everything I had gone through had not been in vain, because it made me someone who could reach back and pull another woman from the edge. And over time I began volunteering with a local support group, offering writing workshops and safe space discussions. And the more I gave, the more I healed. And one evening, while driving home, Elijah reached over and turned down the radio and said, "I think we should get a dog," and I burst out laughing because it was so random and yet so perfect. And a week later, we brought home a scrappy little rescue with mismatched eyes and too much energy, and named him Juniper, and he became part of our life in the kind of way that fills quiet spaces with joy, and barked at the mailman, and chewed Elijah's slippers, and curled up beside me when I wrote late into the night. And one evening, while watching him chase butterflies in the backyard, I felt that same overwhelming peace that had become more familiar with time, and I whispered, "Thank you To the universe, not for making it easy but for giving me the strength to endure and eventually thrive. And there was a day not long after that when I received an invitation to my cousin's wedding, someone who had been distant during the storm, but always quietly supportive, and I debated going for days, wondering if it would be awkward or painful, and in the end I decided yes, because healing does not mean avoiding the past. It means facing it without fear. And when I arrived at the venue wearing a deep green dress that made me feel strong, I walked in alone, head held high, and was immediately embraced by cousins who whispered, "I am so proud of you, and you look radiant," and I knew then that the shame I once carried no longer belonged to me. And when I saw Bri across the room, standing with a drink in her hand, wearing a tight smile, I felt nothing, not hate, not bitterness, just a hollow disinterest, and that freedom was the real gift. And as the night wore on, I danced and laughed and celebrated without shrinking. And when someone asked me how I was doing, I said honestly, "I have never been better," and meant every word. Months passed and life kept moving forward at a pace that felt gentle but steady, like a river smoothing out jagged stones. And as autumn arrived with its crisp air and gold leaf edges, I found myself invited to speak at another university, this time to a group of graduate students studying trauma recovery through narrative. And it struck me how far things had come from that moment when I first sat at a coffee shop, drafting the outline of my story with shaking hands. And now here I was walking into lecture halls where people waited to hear me speak, not as someone broken, but as someone who had rebuilt something meaningful from ruin. And after the talk, a young man approached me with tears in his eyes and said, "Your words gave me permission to feel my own pain." And I thanked him with a quiet nod, because there was nothing more sacred than being part of someone else's healing, even in a small way. And back home, Elijah was waiting with dinner on the stove, and he had found my favorite wine, and Juniper barked joyfully as soon as I stepped through the door. And everything about that moment felt like a reward, not for surviving, but for choosing again and again to keep going even when it hurt. And around that time, Bri reached out again, this time through a mutual friend, asking if I would consider meeting her for coffee, and part of me laughed, because the audacity was stunning, but another part of me had grown curious, not out of hope, but from a place of finality, like closing a book by reading the last page. And I agreed under strict terms, public place, daylight, 1 hour. And when the day arrived, I wore black, not for mourning, but for armor, and I arrived early and chose a seat by the window. And when she walked in, she looked older, not in years, but in weight and wear, and she sat slowly, as if unsure she belonged. And for a while we said nothing, just stared at our mugs. And then she began with, "I do not expect you to forgive me." And I said, "Good, because I do not." And she nodded like she knew that was coming. And then she said I did love him, or I thought I did, but it was never real, not really, and I ruined everything for something hollow. And I looked at her and asked why, and she said, "Because I was jealous and angry, and I wanted to be you." And that truth hit harder than I thought it would, because it was the root of everything, the years of competition, the cold shoulders undermining the final betrayal, all because she could not bear to be in my shadow, even when I tried to step out of it. And she said, "I know it does not change anything, but I am sorry." And I just nodded, not because I accepted it, but because I acknowledged it. And then she asked how I was, and I said I was healing, and that was enough. And when the hour was up, I stood to leave, and she did not ask for a hug or more time. And I respected that and walked away lighter, not because anything had been fixed, but because I had faced it without crumbling. And that night Elijah and I sat in bed with our legs tangled, and I told him everything, and he said, "You are the strongest person I know." And I believed him, not because I felt strong all the time, but because strength was not about never falling, it was about rising again with grace. And in the weeks that followed, I wrote new pieces about what closure really looked like, how it is not a grand gesture or a perfect apology, but a quiet decision to stop bleeding from the same wound. And I received letters from readers saying they too had found peace in places they never thought to look. And one woman wrote that she finally filed for divorce after years of silence. And another said she went back to school at 45 because my book reminded her it was not too late. And those messages became my fuel, reminding me that pain transformed into purpose is the most powerful force there is. And in December, Elijah and I traveled to the mountains for a week away, just us in the snow, and on the second night he knelt down in front of the fire and pulled out a ring simple silver with a small emerald. And he said, I know we already promised each other forever, but I want to do it again, this time with no ghosts watching. And I burst into tears because there was nothing left of the girl who once wore white lace beside a man who lied, and every part of me belonged here now with him. And we exchanged vows under a canopy of pine trees with no audience but the wind, and afterward we danced barefoot in the snow, and I laughed so hard I forgot for a moment every sorrow that came before, and when we came home the world felt new again, not because it had changed, but because I had. And some time later I received word that Caleb had been arrested again, this time for fraud and coercion. And instead of feeling vindicated, I felt numb, because evil has a way of circling back on itself, and I prayed for the woman who would need to climb out of that wreckage next. And I sent the article to the woman who had written to me once about him, and she replied with one sentence, he always finds a way to destroy. And I said back, not always, sometimes we make it out. And she replied with a heart, and I knew she was still fighting, and I hoped she would win. And one afternoon, while walking through the bookstore, I found my book on a display table marked staff favorite, and my hands trembled as I picked it up and flipped through the pages that once felt like open wounds and now read like scars, proud and healed. And behind me a girl tapped my shoulder and said, is that yours? And I said yes, and she smiled and said I loved it, and that smile stayed with me the rest of the day. And back home I placed a new frame on my desk, one that held a photo from the mountain ceremony, and every time I looked at it I was reminded that real love shows up without conditions and builds instead of burns. And then one evening, as Elijah and I hosted dinner for a few friends, someone asked, what is next for you? And I looked at the faces around the table, people who had seen me cry and grow and laugh again. And I said, I do not know exactly, but whatever it is, I am ready. And that was the truth, because the future no longer frightened me, not because it promised to be easy, but because I had already walked through fire and come out brighter on the other side. And that is a kind of freedom no one can take away. The new year arrived with a kind of calm that felt like exhaling after holding my breath for far too long. And even though the world outside still spun with the same noise and demands, I had created something quieter inside myself, a space where peace did not need perfection, and where love did not need performance. And Elijah and I began planning a small community reading event at the local library, something we had dreamed about for months. And it felt beautiful to build something for others from the very words that had once held me together. And I reached out to women's shelters, schools, and support groups offering free copies of my book and open discussions, and the response overwhelmed me in the best way. And one woman said she had not read anything in years because she thought her pain made her stupid, but something in my story called her back to her own voice, and she cried when she said it. And I cried too, because I knew that feeling, the one where survival becomes so loud you cannot hear anything else. And as we moved deeper into the planning, I found myself working with a group of volunteers who reminded me what joy looks like when it is shared freely. And there was one young girl named Layla, barely 16, with a quiet fire in her eyes, who told me that she wanted to become a therapist one day because she had watched her mother fall apart and wanted to be the kind of person who helps women put themselves back together. And I told her she already was, and she hugged me so tightly I could feel the promise in her bones. And on the day of the event, the library filled with people, some old, some young, many with stories written in their posture and their silence. And I stood before them with a microphone and no script, just my heart. And I spoke not about betrayal or revenge, but about the long walk back to yourself, and about how forgiveness is not a gift to others, but a release for your own soul. And I shared how I used to think strength was about silence and endurance, but now I know it is about softness that refuses to die. And when I finished, no one clapped at first. They just sat with it, and then someone stood and others followed, and it was not applause, it was acknowledgement. And afterward people came up to share their stories, and one man said he had been sober for 4 years, but had never told anyone that his first drink came after watching his father hit his mother. And he said reading my book gave him permission to finally talk. And a woman shared that she had been living with a partner who belittled her daily, but seeing me speak made her realize she was not imagining her pain, and she had value, and she was going to leave. And we exchanged numbers, and I told her she was not alone, and I meant it. and later that evening Elijah and I stayed behind cleaning up the space with tired hands and full hearts, and we danced slowly between bookshelves when the lights were dimmed, and it felt sacred, like everything we had lived through had led here to this moment of joy born from ashes. And in the following weeks we kept receiving messages, photos from people reading my book in parks, on buses, in waiting rooms, and it felt like a ripple, a quiet revolution. And one day, while going through mail, I found a letter with handwriting I recognized but had not seen in years, and it was from my father, and inside was a short note saying he had read my book and he was sorry, and that if I ever wanted to talk he would be waiting. And it shook me, not because I wanted to rush to him, but because it felt like an end to a sentence I had been living inside for too long. And I showed Elijah, and he said, "Whatever you choose, I support you." And I placed the letter in a drawer, not out of anger, but as a boundary, because not every wound needs a reunion to heal. And around that time Bry sent a gift, a small photo frame with no note, and inside was a picture of us as kids, before everything, before jealousy, before betrayal. And I stared at it for a long time, and then placed it face down in the same drawer as my father's letter, because the past has a place but not a throne. And one evening, while walking through the market, I saw a couple arguing, and the woman flinched at sudden movement, and I stepped closer just enough to make sure she saw me, and she nodded a silent thank you. And I knew then that sometimes survival means becoming the kind of presence that shifts the air just enough to change the outcome. And I carried that with me into every room afterward, knowing I could be that shift, that warning, that reminder that you are seen. And that was not just healing, that was power. And it was not long before I received an offer to adapt my book into a limited series. And at first I hesitated, because it meant opening the story to new eyes, new opinions, new risks. But then I remembered why I wrote it: not for fame, not for revenge, but for the girl who could not scream, and the woman who could not leave, and the child who thought pain was normal. And I said yes, and I met with producers who listened carefully and respected the core of what I had written, and they asked if I wanted to consult, and I said only if I could approve the final script, because this was not entertainment, it was truth. And they agreed, and suddenly I found myself in writing rooms again, only this time I was not the silent observer. I was the voice, the guide, the anchor, and it felt like justice to be the one who decided how my story was told. And the actress they cast to play me was a quiet powerhouse who reminded me of who I once was. And I met her on set, and she said, "I hope I do you justice." And I told her if she told the truth, that was enough. And when the cameras rolled for the first scene, I watched from behind the monitor, and tears fell, because the words that once trembled in my hands were now moving across the screen, and I could almost hear the heartbeat of every woman watching from her own silence. And I knew then that I had done something bigger than myself. And I called my publisher and said, "I want to start a foundation for survivors who want to write their stories." And we named it Echo, because pain echoes, but so does truth. And we began offering workshops, scholarships, community spaces. And within months we had dozens of women and a few men joining and writing and reclaiming. And I sat with them week after week, listening, crying, laughing. And one woman said, "I thought I was broken, but maybe I am just opening." And I held her hand and said, "Maybe you are becoming." And I believed it with every part of me. And one morning I woke up to an email from a girl in another country who said, "I found your book in a hostel, and it changed me, and I wanted you to know." And that was enough, because when your pain becomes someone else's lantern, you know it was not in vain. The day we launched the Echo Foundation's first major campaign felt like standing on a rooftop and shouting into the world, not for help, but for change. And our goal was to provide 300 women across the country with writing grants and emotional recovery mentorship. And we named it Project Voice. And I still remember sitting at the long wooden table in our new rented office, surrounded by women who had lived through fire and chose not just to survive, but to light new torches from their pain. And there was something holy in that energy, in that space filled with cheap coffee laptops, with cracked corners and hearts that had once broken but beat louder now. And I gave the opening speech on a live stream. And as I spoke, I felt every tremble in my voice transform into steadiness. And I talked about what it means to give someone their story back, and how the system steals voices through shame and silence. But we were not asking anymore, we were reclaiming. And during that week, applications poured in from towns and cities I had never heard of, and each one carried a sliver of someone's truth, sometimes in neat typed lines, sometimes scrawled in barely legible ink. And there was one from a woman named Rosa, who said she lived in a small house with peeling paint and a husband who watched her sleep because he did not trust dreams, and she wrote that she had not spoken out loud in 6 months, but reading my book made her whisper again, and I chose her application myself and sent her email saying your voice belongs to you, and she replied with a photo of her standing in her garden holding a pen like a sword. And I cried for 10 minutes straight. And another story came from an older woman named Eleanor, who said she had been widowed for 3 decades and had never told anyone that her husband used to lock the pantry at night to control how much she ate, and she said maybe it was not as bad as what others went through, but it haunted her, and she wanted to write about hunger. And I wrote back saying pain does not need permission to matter, and we sent her a laptop and a printed letter signed by all of us, and she called our office crying and said this was the first time anyone had said she mattered. And I felt something shift deep in me, like all the years of silence had become seeds, and now they were blooming across the country. And during one of our feedback calls, a woman named Tasha, who was working on a memoir about escaping a cult, said she had been approached by a local publisher, but they wanted her to tone down the parts that made readers uncomfortable, and she asked what I would do, and I told her if your truth makes them flinch, then they are not your audience, and she smiled and said then I will write it loud and raw, and we put her in touch with a woman known press that specialized in trauma narratives, and 3 months later her book hit number 3 on the national nonfiction list, and she called me sobbing saying they want to put it in high schools, and I remembered how once I had doubted that any of this would matter, and now it was changing lives. And meanwhile, Elijah and I were planning a short retreat for survivors who had completed their manuscripts, a weekend of storytelling, nature, and healing, and we rented a lodge up north near the river, where everything smelled like pine and fresh starts. And when we arrived, the women were quiet at first, some holding books like shields, others laughing too loudly as a defense. And I gathered them in the main room by the fire and told them we would start with silence, and we did 5 whole minutes of breathing, and no one filled it with apologies. And afterward we went around sharing the hardest lines we had ever written, and one woman said, I am not dirty, I was never dirty, and the room fell apart in the best way possible, and we cried and held each other, and later we danced in mismatched socks, and someone played an old guitar and sang off key, and I thought this is church, and I was not wrong. And by the end of the weekend women were hugging like sisters, like survivors, like poets, and I stood by the window on the last night watching snow fall slowly, and Elijah came and put his arms around me and whispered, look what you made, and I shook my head and said, look what we became. And as we drove home I got a call from a producer at a major network saying they had seen our retreat video online and wanted to do a feature, and I paused for a long time before saying, only if you show the women as full human beings, not statistics, not sob stories. And he said we would, and I believed him, and they sent a crew to film over 4 days, and when the segment aired it went viral, not because of me, but because of the women who stood tall and said their names and their truths and refused to be boxed. And weeks after that, we received more applications, donations, messages, and I hired 4 more staff members, all survivors, all storytellers. And one night during a strategy meeting, someone asked if we should expand internationally, and I said not yet, not until we make sure our roots are deep and strong. And I meant it, and that night I sat alone in my office after everyone left, reading an old journal of mine from the year 2010 back, when I still believed love meant sacrifice, and I read a line where I wrote, I hope someone chooses me someday, and I laughed soft and sad because I had finally chosen myself, and maybe that was the point all along. And sometime later I got an unexpected email from Lee, my sister, with no subject line, and inside was a short message saying, I am sorry, not because you won, but because I finally understand what I lost. And I did not reply, not out of spite, because some roads do not need retracing, and I forwarded it to Elijah, and he replied with a single line, you chose peace, and I did, and I kept choosing it every day in small ways, in big ones, and that choice grew into a life I never imagined, a life where pain was not erased but transformed, and that was the most radical kind of freedom I could offer, and every night before bed I read one story from our community and whispered their names like prayers, like promises, like fire carried forward. The weeks that followed were full of a strange stillness, as if life itself had paused to watch what I would do next, and it was not fear that held me in place anymore, but a quiet caution carved out of too many sharp memories. And even though the news coverage of our foundation kept spreading and interviews rolled in one after the other, I found myself avoiding mirrors because I did not want to see the version of me who had believed so easily in things that could never last. And one afternoon, as I sorted through a box of old letters to digitize for a memoir project, I found a photo tucked inside a thick envelope. It was taken at my engagement party with Elijah, and there in the corner was Lee, barely smiling, and I noticed for the first time that her hand was gripping a wine glass too tightly, and her eyes were locked on him, not me, and something about that image stayed with me, not as a wound but as a final answer. And that night I lay awake thinking about how many signs I had missed because I was busy loving people who did not know how to love me back, and it hurt in a clean, almost mathematical way, the way realizations do when there is no longer emotion attached, just fact. And slowly I started talking to my mother again, not out of obligation, but because one day she sent a voice note that simply said, "I know I failed you and I am sorry," and I did not reply immediately, but I listened to it every night for a week until it stopped feeling like bait and started sounding like truth. And when I finally called her, we did not rehash everything. Instead, we talked about how her garden was doing, and she said the jasmine had returned stronger than ever. And I told her that sounded like something worth writing about, and she laughed and said, "Maybe you got that from me," and I did not disagree. And after that we spoke weekly, and it was not perfect, but it was something. And in early spring of 2022, our team at Echo decided to host a storytelling gala for survivors, a way to celebrate the stories that had been published, the women who had found their voices, and those who were still writing. And I wore a pale gold gown with sleeves like wings, and Elijah wore a midnight blue suit, and when we walked in together, I felt eyes follow us, not because of how we looked, but because of what we had survived together. And the keynote speaker was Tasha, whose memoir had become required reading at 3 universities, and she opened with the line, "I thought silence would save me, but it almost buried me," and by the end of her speech the entire hall stood in applause. And after that we handed out 15 awards, each named after a different virtue: strength, truth, courage, grace. And when my name was called for the final award, a lifetime impact recognition, I stood there blinking back tears because I had not realized just how much it meant until that moment. And I spoke briefly not about me, but about the women who walked through fire and came out lighting paths for others. And I ended with a single line, "Your voice is not a debt," and it was met with silence, then thunder. And after the event I stepped out into the night alone just for a breath, and found Lee standing by a tree in a black coat, and I froze not because I was afraid, but because I had not expected her. And she said, "I came to see what I destroyed," and I said, "You did not destroy me." And she nodded and said, "I know that now." And we stood there, not as sisters, not as enemies, but as 2 women who had broken and rebuilt in opposite directions. And she said, "I kept the ultrasound picture," and I said, "That is your burden, not mine." And she flinched slightly, then said, "He left me a year after the baby was born." And I said, "I am not surprised." And she said, "I thought you might want to see her." And I shook my head and said, "Not today, maybe not ever." And she nodded again and walked away, and I let her. And when I returned inside, Elijah touched my hand and said, "You okay?" And I said, "I am still standing." And he smiled like that was more than enough. And later that month we finally bought a small house by the lake, a place with creaky floors and wide windows and a fireplace that smoked too much, and we loved it instantly because it was ours. And the first night we slept there we did not unpack, we just made a blanket nest in the living room and talked until the fire went out. And I told him I was scared of how happy I was, and he said, "Happiness is not a trick, it is a muscle you build." And I held on to that, and we started hosting monthly gatherings for survivors at our home, potlucks with poetry and laughter and wine that did not lead to shouting. And slowly I began to feel what peace might look like, not as a prize, but as a practice. And sometimes I would get emails from people who had read my book saying they saw themselves in my story, and that made me cry in the best way. And one message came from a young man who said he had grown up watching his mother hide bruises, and reading my words helped him forgive her, and I printed that message and pinned it to my wall because healing is not linear, and neither is impact and on. The anniversary of our first retreat, we went back to the same lodge, this time with 20 new women, and we held a bonfire and passed around a wooden box where each woman could drop a note to her past self. And later we read them aloud, and one said, "I forgive you for believing them," and another said, "You did your best," and I said mine out loud. I said, "I am proud of you for leaving even when no one clapped." And after that we released sky lanterns and watched them drift upward like prayers that finally found air. And as we packed to leave, one of the women hugged me tightly and said, "You made space where there was none," and I thought, yes, that is what I wanted all along. And when we drove back home, Elijah reached for my hand and said, "Do you ever think about how it all began?" And I said, "Every day." And he said, "And do you regret it?" And I said, "Only the years I stayed quiet." And he kissed the back of my hand and said, "Then speak louder." And I laughed and said, "Always." And when we got home, I sat down to write again, not a memoir this time, but fiction, a story about a woman who loses everything and finds herself, and I filled page after page with scenes that felt like breath, and I knew then that I had turned the corner, not by forgetting, but by surviving and choosing to thrive. And when I finally wrote the words, "the end," I did not cry, because it was not the end, not really, it was just another beginning. After that spring, the seasons came and went with a kind of softness I had not known in years, and my days became full of things that made sense again, not because everything was perfect, but because everything was honest, and I found joy in the ordinary, like the way the sunlight moved across a kitchen floor, or how Elijah always remembered to pick up fresh bread on Thursdays. And I started sleeping deeply again, not always but enough, and sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night and lie there listening to the silence that was no longer empty, and I would think about all versions of myself I had been, and I would send them love because they had all tried. And one afternoon in early autumn, I got a call from a local college asking if I would be interested in teaching a course on personal storytelling and trauma recovery. And at first I hesitated because the idea of standing in front of a classroom again felt too large, but Elijah said, "You do not need to be whole to teach healing, you just need to be honest," and that stayed with me, so I said yes. And the first day I walked into that lecture hall, I felt something click into place, and the students looked at me not as someone with answers, but as someone who could guide them to their own. And I told them on the first day that stories are not therapy, but they are tools, and that silence has never saved anyone. And they took that in quietly, and by the end of the semester, they had written things that made me cry and made me proud. And outside of class, I kept working with the foundation, and we expanded to include resources for families and support groups for men who had seen the cycle up close and wanted to end it. And we launched an online archive of anonymous letters from survivors, and it grew faster than we expected. And one night, as I read through the newest submissions, I saw one that began with "I blamed her until I became her," and I sat back in my chair because I knew the courage it took to write that. And in those moments I felt like everything had come full circle, not in a perfect bow, but in a way that made sense, like rain returning to the ocean. And that winter I turned 35, and we had a small gathering at our home, just a few close friends, soft music, warm food. And someone brought a video montage of the past 5 years, and it was jarring at first to see the old photos, the moment frozen in time where I looked so different and yet still me. And when the video ended, Elijah stood and raised a toast, and he said, "I fell in love with her twice, once when she did not know her own strength, and again when she showed the world," and I could not look at him without my eyes stinging. And afterward, when the guests left and the night settled into quiet, we sat by the fireplace, and he said, "Do you ever miss the life we thought we would have?" And I said, "Sometimes, but then I remember that we built something better." And he nodded and said, "We made a home out of ashes, and it bloomed." And that spring I published my second book, a novel inspired by real events but shaped by imagination, and it was about betrayal and rebuilding and sisters and silence. And when it was released, the first review called it devastating and hopeful in equal measure, and I cried not because of the praise, but because I had written something true even in fiction, and Lee reached out after reading it. She sent a short email. It said I recognized myself and I am sorry, and I did not reply because I no longer needed to, and I no longer owed anything to the version of her that chose to hurt me, and sometimes I would see her on social media and snapshots of someone else's life, and I would feel nothing, and that was a victory. And one afternoon in late summer, Elijah and I walked by the river, and I saw a group of young girls laughing on the steps near the water, and one of them looked up and I thought she was about to ask for a photo, but instead she said, "You helped my mom leave," and I said I am glad she did, and the girl smiled and ran back to her friends, and I stood there feeling like all of it had meant something, and years passed and the world changed, and so did we, and I kept teaching and writing and listening. And Elijah kept building his art projects with wood and metal and fire, and we traveled when we could, small places that did not feel heavy with memory, and sometimes we talked about fostering when the time felt right, and one day we did, and a boy named Micah came into our home with a scar on his cheek and more fear in his eyes than I had ever seen, and slowly we taught him safety, and slowly he taught us joy, and on the night of his 8th birthday he whispered, "You feel like mine," and I held him until he fell asleep, and Elijah said, "I think we just became parents," and I laughed quietly and said, "I think we did," and the house filled with new sounds, toys and music, and the occasional loud argument about bedtime, and it was everything I never thought I would get. And one evening I found Micah drawing at the table, and he showed me a picture of 3 stick figures holding hands, and he said, "This is our family," and I asked, "Why does it only have 3?" And he said, "Because it is just us, and we are enough," and I kissed his forehead and said, "Yes, we are." And years later, when someone asked me in an interview what forgiveness means, I said it is choosing not to let the past drag you under, and choosing instead to use it as ground to build on. And when they asked me about Lee, I said I wish her peace, but I no longer carry her story. And when they asked me about love, I said it is not a rescue, it is a choice made every day to stand beside each other through storms and through sun. And when they asked me if I would change anything, I said maybe I would have left earlier, maybe I would have listened to my gut sooner, but the truth is I do not think I would be who I am without every bruise and every breakthrough. And when they asked if I believed in happy endings, I said no, I believe in honest ones. And this is mine outro. This story is not just about revenge. It is about truth, pain, and rising stronger than before. If this hit your heart, then you know what to do. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more real stories that burn like fire. Until next time, stay sharp, stay loud, stay rebel.